Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the joint CCSI Steptoe speaker series on extractive industry persistent issues. We're thrilled to be here for the second session after having a first great session on the issue of the need for balance between regulatory stability and regulatory flexibility. I'm Christoph Bondi of Steptoe LLP's International Disputes Department based in London. Today's discussion is going to focus on the issue of what is a fair deal. And we've had interesting discussions in preparation for this meeting between the panelists, and I'll introduce the panelists in a moment. Really interesting thinking about the challenges of a fair deal in the extractive industry sector, where you have sometimes a lack of information at the front end about how much the actual project is going to cost, what are the actual benefits that are going to flow from the project, the fact that the projects last over a long period of time and the actors can change. So those already pose challenges to figuring out a fair deal over the long term, but also what emerged from our discussion, and Lisa's flagged this, is the issue of, well, what is fair, and the different elements that go to what is a fair deal? Is it an economic deal? Is it the fact that the deal doesn't change? Is it, what contributions to which stakeholders? And those things are all things we're going to explore today. We've got a terrific panel joining us today, which reflects a range of really rich experience, and just taking them in no particular order. Ignacio Bustamante is head of base metals at Appian Capital Advisory LLP. So they're substantial investors in extractive projects. And Ignacio, in addition to currently overseeing Appian's operation and growth strategies across all base metals, he is originally from Peru and has significant experience managing operations in Latin America, including a multi-decade career as in senior leadership of extractive companies. So that he will bring his perspective. Antonio Pedro is Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Pedro is a mineral exploration geologist by training, with more than 40 years experience and broad experience and exposure to international development issues and management of such issues at all levels. Amir Sheikh is currently lead counsel for institutional affairs and head of litigation at the World Bank, and he previously served as chief counsel operations for the African Legal Support Facility, where he lived and breathed contract negotiations between governments and the private sector. Sally Swartz is former chair of the international section of the American Bar Association. She's practiced international business law in Paris since 1979 and is focused on international mergers and acquisitions, negotiating and drafting joint ventures and consortia, particularly in the extractive industries. So bringing that perspective. And Joe Tato is senior counsel at Steptoe, and he, over the course of his lengthy career, has regularly represented project sponsors, equity investors, financial institutions, and governments in development, finance, restructuring, and workouts of all sorts of energy and resource-related infrastructure projects and deals in Africa, Latin America, and Europe, and has substantial experience in negotiating international investment and host and stabilization agreements. So that just gives you a very quick overview of the range of experience we have to bring to bear. And of course, we're going to be led in this discussion by Lisa Sachs, who will be skillfully balancing the questions, and we look forward to questions that could be posted by members of the audience in the question. We'll try to integrate those into the discussion. I don't want to take away from the time, so Lisa, I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Christoph, and thanks again to you, Christoph, and to Steptoe for partnering on and enabling this series. For those who joined the first session, you know what a treat you're in for. For those who weren't able to, it's posted live, and I highly recommend it. The first session was a remarkably honest and therefore refreshing reflection on after 20 years of work that many of us have done to advance resource-based development. And I expect the same and more from this session too. This whole series, as Christoph said, is grounded in a increasingly shared recognition that despite decades of our efforts through principles and toolkits and initiatives and technical support and capacity building, that the promise of resource-based development has remained largely elusive, and that for resource-rich countries, the development gains that were envisioned and mining communities who were expecting or promised to be better off for the mining projects, that at least their expectations have not been met. And at worst, one can say that we have failed to lift many of these regions out of poverty. So throughout these 4 sessions, we are exploring some of the deep structural tensions that have hindered better outcomes, and asking not just what isn't working, but why, and what would it take to do better. And each session focuses, as Christoph said, as one of these critical tensions. So I'm very excited for today's session. As some of you know, and certainly our panelists, I've mentioned that one of our panelists, Amir Sheikh, and we asked ourselves this same question, I think exactly 15 years ago, recognizing already then that there were not shared understandings in the field about what a fair deal was, and whether that was a problem, and if so, what could be done to better define it. 15 years later, I think the challenge is even more profound, and I would say it's because I think that there are many fundamentally competing ideas of fairness. Some consider that the resources belong to the state, and therefore a fair deal is one where the state enjoys the majority of the benefits. Some consider that companies bear the majority of the risk, and bring the know-how and the technology and the capital, and therefore a fair deal is one that rewards the risk taker while ensuring some compensation, proper compensation, and minimal impacts for the country and the communities. Some consider that it's those who bear the greatest impacts from mining, particularly those around the mine site, but also within the country and the community, that bear the greatest risks, that a fair deal is one that ensures that they are better off, that the net benefits are positive for the community. And others, I think, consider fairness to be that expectations are managed and met, and that the deal is durable and flexible, and can avoid disputes. So these are foundational issues of competing visions and values and expectations. And I think the more I've realized about the different views of fairness, the more I consider this to be an unresolved tension that sits at the core of why outcomes have been so unsatisfactory to different parties. So mostly I'm just extraordinarily grateful to benefit from the decades of experience of our panelists who have been working on these issues, at negotiating the deals, advising governments, structuring the investments, and grappling with the practical consequences of when things don't work and when they do. So without any further ado, what I'm hoping for is a really active and engaged discussion among the panelists, and with the participants who are joining. So again, as Christoph said, please, we have a ask Q&A in the bottom, and we'll start off with some brief reflections that I'll ask kind of to try to draw out what I know to be some of the particular insights of our panelists, and then open it up for broader discussion. So I hope that we have Pedro on. Do we not yet? We don't yet. Okay, I know he was having trouble connecting. So I had hoped to start with Pedro because actually in terms of chronology, I've been working with Pedro on these issues for the longest. But maybe let me, Amir, as yours the second longest chronologically that I've been working on these issues. As I said, Amir, you and I talked about this 15 years ago. In light of these multiple and sometimes conflicting conceptions of fairness, and you have been at the negotiating table and helping countries to advise this, I'm wondering if you can opine on whether it's even possible or advisable to have some more objective standard of fairness, and what would be the advantages or disadvantages of trying to not only have a shared understanding, but even possibly to quantify what fairness might look like in practice.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm going to start this off with a quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's from Bill Watterson, who wrote the cartoon Calvin and Hobbes. For those who aren't familiar, but it's this is the dad and the son talking to each other, and the son goes, "The world isn't," or the dad goes, "The world isn't fair, Calvin." And Calvin responds, "I know, Dad, but why isn't it ever unfair in my favor?" And I think that's the tension that we always face on these things is defining fairness is a very personal concept of what fairness is. And it's hard to say what is fair, but we can all say what is unfair. And I think that's kind of one of the approaches that I've always taken to this when trying to get what fairness is, and boil it down to what matters. And in a mining contract, it's a multi-stakeholder. There's communities involved, there's parliaments involved, there's government officials involved, there's private investors involved, there's banks behind those investors, right? There's the mining company, there's the workers. You've got all of these different stakeholders, and everyone has that same fundamental idea of what's fair for them or what's unfair for them. And I think that's the tension which I think you were getting to, Lisa, that I really, really struggle with and I don't have brilliant answers for. But it's always been my obsession, and you and I know this, is to try figuring out, can we quantify this? How would we quantify this? And then is it a good idea to quantify it? I'm going to take those probably backwards. First, is it a good idea to quantify it? Personally, I think so. And the reason I'd say that is because if we don't quantify it, somebody else will. And mainly it's the mining companies who are quantifying it for themselves. They have complex models that they derive to decide whether or not they're going to make an investment decision, right? And so there already is a quantification at the core of every one of these mining deals and concessions. And then I think the second thing is, you know, but how do we do it? And that's really complicated because that's one stakeholder. Well, how do the other stakeholders do that? What do they do it? And that's where I think we get into trouble. And that's why I don't think we found a solution to this yet. Because you have such diverse viewpoints of what's fair to me, um, we haven't figured something out. I've always envisioned like a traffic signal type thing of like, okay, green, this was really good by some objective standard, yellow, this was okay, and red. And then you'd post that up, and when the deal goes to Parliament, they'd be able to see all the different um, you know, factors at the same time. But the problem is we don't know how they interact. And so I have not figured out yet, and I don't know anybody who's figured out how you get those, the different levers that you can pull on the 35 things in a deal, which may influence fairness out there. So I wish I had a better answer, and that's probably why I think we should do it, but I don't know if we can do it. And that's been my real problem. And I'll stop there. I'll let some others speak.
Thank you so much, Amir. I'm glad to be bringing our conversation at least to the public so we can all think about this together because as you said, I hoped you'd have more answers for us, but let's at least involve others in the brainstorming. Maybe I'll turn next to Sally. Sally, one of the areas in which we've had the privilege to work with you for many, many years is in particular thinking about the flexibility and the durability of these very long-term contracts, because that is one of the defining features of mining projects, is that they last for often decades over varying administrations and generations and changing circumstances and so on. You mentioned when we were speaking before this session that actually arguably even more important than defining fairness might be an emphasis on flexibility and on the ability to meet changing expectations and conditions. So I would love to hear from you particularly, but not only from the specific negotiations that you've been involved in or that you've seen unfold. First of all, do you see this flexibility happening in practice? And if not, why? And if it were achieved, do you think that that would, or how do you think that that would help to meet stakeholders' expectations of fairness, particularly if, as Amir underscored, and as I perceive too, stakeholders are really coming from different fundamental perceptions of what
Right,
outcomes they hope to achieve.
right. Well, thanks, Lisa. Excuse me. Yeah, Christoph did not have time to mention that I've spent about 30 years going back and forth to
Oops.
Tracks. And from what I've seen, everybody seems very unhappy about what they have, what they've negotiated a bit into the contract. To look at fairness, I mean, I actually looked it up to see what that's supposed to mean. And what I found was two definitions: impartial and just treatment or behavior without favoritism or discrimination, and the quality of treating people equally or in a way that is right or reasonable. And as far as I'm concerned, that gets us nowhere. Because of what Amir said, is everybody perceives that something is fair or not fair, but it's not an objective term. So I go back to my thing that I really like to talk about, as Lisa pointed out, is flexibility in contracts, because the assumptions that were relied on by the parties, we don't know what they are. They are rarely communicated by anybody, including I mean, I'll call everybody involved the stakeholders. So that would be the investor, the operating company, the people on the ground, the government, the national government, the local government. And as everyone has talked about for years now, everyone is involved or should be involved, and nobody knows what they're thinking. So my problem is, if we don't communicate with each other on our bottom line, what we want out of this project, then I think we'll never get there. As Lisa or Christoph pointed out, there are gobs of information out there. The CCSI has one of the best sites I've ever seen on helping people negotiate these contracts. I mean, there are examples, there are toolkits, there's everything. And I don't know if anyone's using them, but they should. And so my point of view is that if we should exchange information at the very beginning, because expectations are a moving target. And we've seen this time and time again when the government thinks the investor has incurred windfall profits that are unfair and the government is not happy, or we have an operating company that has encountered unexpected difficulties in mining operations, bad quality of the minerals, or their OPEX has exploded and they don't know how they're going to recover it. I mean, there are a million examples out there of why things go sideways or downwards. So I believe that the parties should exchange the most information as possible. They should all be at the table. Maybe you can't have everyone at the table all the time. That is unrealistic and will create probably a lot of chaos. But expectations should be recorded. And when I mean expectations, I'm talking about financial expectations. During our pre-call, I apologize, but I can't recall who brought it up. Governments are usually quite disappointed with their return, no matter how you structure the deal, whether it's a licensing or permitting or a contract. The governments always feel like they're getting ripped off by the investor or the operating company, or both, because they're usually joint ventures. So, I think that I would like to send you to the article that myself and two other people, which is on the site. It's called Periodic Review of Extractive Contracts, confided under resources on the CCI site. I think the only way we're going to get deals that make sense to most, if not all, the parties is to have a flexible contract. And what that means is that the parties in the beginning need to exchange a very minimum of what their expectations are and what their financial goals are. And maybe they're not goals, maybe they're expectations, maybe they're best wishes, maybe, something that will help us understand what the investors are expecting. I was told, and I know this to be true, that nobody will ever release their return on investment to share with governments. I understand that, but I think a minimum of information can be exchanged so that we can understand what the parties are expecting, all of them. And then the local stakeholders have to understand if they're getting kicked off the land, if they're going to be miles and miles away from water sources, which may in fact be polluted. How is that going to work for them? And what do they want? Now, I know that's a really hard subject because we never know really what informed consent means and with whom exactly, who are the spokespeople, but that we can get over that. Again, there are books and papers and research done on that principle. But to summarize my conclusions is we are never going to get a quote unquote fair deal from the beginning of the contract, because whoever thinks it's fair from day one is probably going to think it's unfair over the next 20 years. So my way of evaluating these are flexibility. Now, to answer Lisa's question, you'll note that I didn't answer it, was it's very hard to negotiate because nobody wants to reveal sufficient information. But I think it's doable, and I think we should push towards it, those of us who negotiate contracts or assist countries with their mining codes, for example, or assist governments with their taxes and their simulation of taxation in any given project. I think we have to push. I really do. And the goal here is to get a contract that will evolve over time, that most parties will think fair, more or less fair, before we get to dispute resolution. Somebody in the pre-call mentioned that we always, or maybe it was in the first call, the first seminar that was held, you don't want to end up in arbitration or in the local courts or national courts, or both, which one would call that a pathological dispute resolution clause. You end up in both places. You can't build trust, because everyone talks about building trust and everyone talks about a social contract and a social license to do business. We can't build it unless people's expectations are met over the course of the contract. So I will leave it there. I'm used to getting attacked on my ideas, so go for it. I don't mind. I'll
Great.
turn off my mic, but I will stop talking. Thank you, Lisa.
I hope you get a little attacked, not because I disagree, but because then we can discuss. I won't attack you because I think you raised some incredibly important points and questions. I'm just going to reiterate one point and then flag questions that I hope we can get to later. I love the idea, Sally, of recording expectations at the beginning, not in the form, not expecting that those expectations will necessarily be enshrined in a contract, or that we should understand a contract to be reflective of expectations. But is there another way to have clarity over what the original expectations are that the contract is expected to reflect? I think that's a really interesting idea. The three questions I just want to underscore, you asked many others, or you point to many others, but three that I just want to make sure that we get back to is, first of all, this point, I love that you say everyone should be at the table, but that would need to be a big table. So
Yeah, right.
who should be at the table, and what happens when people when stakeholders with important perspectives and invested interests are not at the table. I think a second question that you raised that Amir, again, goes back to these conversations from 15 years ago, is what are the elements that matter in terms of assessing fairness? I tend to agree, Sally, with the preeminence of the fiscal terms, and that is that the disagreement over fairness of the fiscal terms is often one of the most fundamental disagreements, and the fiscal terms represent arguably the largest quantifiable aspect of the deal. But I guess one question is whether that's right, or whether there are other critical aspects of fairness. And then you said out of hand, you understand and you take as a given that investors won't share their return information. I would challenge that a little bit and ask why, and what information should we expect to be shared at the outset to support an informed discussion of fairness? And can we arrive at can we arrive at a quote unquote fair deal when not all stakeholders have access to the same information?
Exactly.
And if that is a critical element of the information, then shouldn't that be part of the basic information that is shared to determine fairness? So maybe
actually, it was Joe. It was Joe during our pre-call that I think it was Joe anyway, that said that is unrealistic and it just won't happen. I disagree.
When we get to Joe,
okay, I disagree, but I'm quoting my own co-panelist. And I think that we should be able to find objective criteria that are confidentially shareable.
Great. Well, as anyone knows me knows, I don't take anything as fundamentally a given that we can't change things. We need to be thinking constructively and productively about what needs to change to achieve better outcomes. So good, Joe, you'll have a moment to think before we come back to you, because I
But
wanted to
Lisa-
come to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Lisa, no, Sally's right, but there's a qualifier to a lot of that. So
Okay.
there's internal expectations, because they could be right or wrong. They could be really wrong on the downside as much as they could be wrong on the upside. And there are target ROIs that we've seen in successful projects. And you have to develop and have the methodology to under which the targets could be achieved or not achieved. And if you spend the time doing that, those tend to be, and all the assumptions pan out, they tend to be ones that both sides at least have an ability to understand. And part of what I would say when it's my turn is that I think government needs to take much more of a proactive stance on a lot of these issues. And I think the private sector will welcome that, because
Well-
oftentimes they're shooting in the dark, quite frankly.
I would agree to that, but you have to help them sometimes.
Yeah, oh,
But
I
I agree
agree
with that.
totally. I totally agree. I think
Yeah.
that's where.
Well,
Lisa,
I'm
can I
glad we
jump-
agree, Joe. We wouldn't want to have a fight on Zoom now here, would we?
No, I agree that advice, market information, all of those things, using all the resources that you mentioned, Sally, I think those are critical in forming a process and an expectation of the government, and then letting the private sector. There'll be some that won't agree, then they shouldn't participate.
Well, we conveniently have a representative who can maybe help us understand that perspective. Ignacio, representing, you'll now represent every private sector actor in all of these deals. You have now the authority to speak on everyone's behalf. But so I had wanted to ask you one question, but now I'm going to expand it, not predictably. What I had wanted to ask you, which is a foundational question, is that given all of these, again, competing views of fairness, which of these factors of fairness do you factor in, I would say, to investment decision making? Is it the fiscal take? Is it the durability of the agreements? Is it the idea of whether expectations are being met? So I guess the first foundational question is, which of these factors into investment decisions? But while you're speaking, maybe you can speak on behalf of all investors and speak to this question of what it takes to be on the, what more information could and should be shared by all parties at the outset that might help support more informed understanding and negotiations that would allow for long-term durability, or what are the factors that make that difficult? So Ignacio, over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Lisa. And yeah, I'll get into the question later, but I would say my initial reaction is that I don't see necessarily that the main solution comes from sharing the financial information. No, it can help, but I would say there are many other factors that would need to be considered prior to even getting to that discussion. No? So getting into the question of what a fair deal is. So I would say, and I would like to take a step back on that and convey the message that better or before anything else, one important point is that we all need to continue understanding and pushing the message of how essential mining is to the global development. No, and like everything around us is coming from mine materials, infrastructure, technology, construction, agriculture, the criticality of mining for the energy transition, all the great things that mining does in terms of job creation, infrastructure, economic development, etc. And how important it is to power modern life. No, and I would say that the more people understands, no, at the government level, at the community level, at the general society level, how important mining is, at the end, I would say the easier it's going to be to aim for fairness in these negotiations or in these agreements. In terms of, in my view, what makes a fair deal, Elise and the panel, I think we need to be mindful that all actors play a critical role. So no actor can do this alone. And just for simplification, I know there can be several actors, but just for simplification, let's say we have the government that manages the resources, we have the communities that steward the land, and we have, of course, the investors that bring the capital and the expertise. And no mining project will succeed if all three parties do not work together. And all parties need to be mindful of that, and all of them need to play fairly. In terms of the investment at the end is the catalyst for this value creation, but cannot happen without the other parties. And to unlock that investment, companies naturally tend to prioritize countries that offer, obviously beyond the technical and the financial factors, clear and stable rules, defined and reliable partners, rule of law and contract enforcement, and a culture that understands and supports responsible mining. The more developed a country is on those areas, the more attractive it's going to be for the investment community. So in summary, in my view, fairness means sustained value for everyone, governments, communities, and investors in general. In terms of from the company, what for investors represents a fairness, or how we need to see fairness from our own side. What is in our core is we need to make sure that we build strong relationship with communities. If we have the philosophy that we need the government to solve our community issues, then I can tell you there's not going to be any future, and that's not going to be sustainable. We need to make sure that we build directly those strong relationships with the communities, regardless of the role that the government may play. We need to make sure that we play by the rules, so we play and we follow the best practices of safety, environment, engagements, and we take no shortcuts. We need to act respectfully as guests. We need to recognize that we're guests in these community lands, and we need to fulfill all the commitments that we do. No, and it's not important to operate or just to be accepted by the communities. You have to be welcome. No, and that change in mind shift is very important. No, you want them to want you there, no, not to just accept you or tolerate you. In terms of from the government standpoint, I believe also it's very important that the government plays its part and needs to understand that and convey this message of how critical, how essential mining is to everybody, community, society in general, and that mining is not an option, it's a necessity for the development of the world. Also, we permanently have to deal with a lot of issues of being put in the same bucket, professional, responsible miners from illegal or irresponsible operators. And we tend to be put in the same bucket, and the media in general, when something bad happens, which are the news that are most enjoyed by or read by the communities, tend to be more related to the illegal or responsible operators, no? So, but they do not make that difference. So I think it's important that the government continues helping the sector to make that difference between who are the responsible professional operators from the rest. Governments need to work also on finishing this anti-mining rhetoric that in many countries is popular for elections, etc., but at the end creates a lot of damage in our societies. Also share openly the benefits that mining brings to the communities, to the country in general, in terms of revenues and development. And of course, make sure that they maintain predictable governance and respect the agreements. No? So in general, the government needs to play its part and be able to recognize good miners and also help communities see the benefits of this. And from a community standpoint, they also need to act fair. So they need to stay very vigilant against outside actors with hidden agendas. And I can tell you from my experience operating in many countries, most of the community issues that I have had experience with have been brought by third parties that have nothing to do with communities looking for a personal benefit, that have created a problem or exaggerated a problem, making themselves important and being able to benefit from that. That's a reality, you know. So communities need to be alert and vigilant from that. Obviously, TAMI also needs to honor negotiated agreements, be transparent and open when concerns arise, and build their own internal governance that represents all community members. No? So to me, even before going to whether we need to share the numbers, etc., I think it's important to be fair, to be mining, for there to be mining and for mining to be successful, all three parties need to work together, and we all need to do our part. In the specific question of sharing the numbers, what I would say is that there are a lot of companies that publicly share their numbers. For example, public companies or companies that follow international reporting standards, they do publish their numbers. And they do get the details of the feasibility, the rate of returns. No, I fully agree with Joe that in most of the cases, those numbers are not accomplished, and there are positive and negative surprises. I can say mostly negative surprises, except for price differences. But I would say, yeah, it's important to have an order of magnitude, and I would say it's probably more important because it shows that we're not talking here about crazy numbers. No, we're talking about rates of return for the investment that are very reasonable for the level of investment and risks that are associated, that makes it similar to other industries. No? So it's something I would say it would be beneficial to share so that people know why mining cannot be taken as all the investors are taking all the money and not leaving anything. I think that's far from being the truth. So many companies share their numbers, not all of them. In general, I would say yes. I'm in favor. Having worked in public companies, we are used to sharing our numbers. But I would say that I would probably leave that as a secondary discussion and focus more on each of us doing our own share of the deal.
Thank you so much, Ignacio. Because I really want us to have an honest and constructive conversation, I'm going to challenge you on a couple of the things you said so that we can try to resolve it from my perspective. One is this suggestion that mining isn't necessary for the benefit of the world. I agree with that, and we have produced a MOOC on the role of mining and metals in the sustainable development transformations. But that is not something to convince communities of. I found it crazy in a recent Financial Times article on Panama that the company operating in Panama was saying to the community, you don't understand, the copper under your soil is needed for lawnmowers and iWatches. And this is in the article in the Financial Times. I'm not exaggerating. Lawnmowers, iWatches, because it should have been Apple Watches, and iPads. That is not something to convince the community of. The community is the one bearing the impact and not realizing the benefits. So I do think this narrative of the idea that we should be convincing communities of the importance of the minerals under their soil is really misunderstanding the concerns and the challenges that the communities are experiencing. A second question that I would ask to the whole panel, because I've started asking this to everyone, is can we point to more than 5? I would take 1, but can we point to more than 5 communities at the mine site that have been propelled to sustainable development because of a mining project? I can't think of 1, but I would challenge us to think of 5 in case there's 1. So this argument that we need to convince the communities of the benefit, why should communities believe that when we can't point to, unless you can, examples of when communities have been propelled to development because of the mine site? The third thing you said is that we should distinguish between the professional, another thing you said is that we should distinguish between the professional operators and not. But I would just point out, and again, we work extremely closely with wonderful world-class mining companies who I know, by the way, are really trying. I know they are really trying, and we work with them very closely. But also, to be realistic, some of the largest, most responsible mining companies have been involved in some of the most tragic disasters in recent years: social, environmental, fiscal controversies, and so on. So I don't think this is a reputation issue. I think it's something more. This is not to say that the mining companies are not trying. They are. But if we want to address this honestly, we also, I don't think, can represent it as a controversy, as a reputational thing alone. And then the other thing I've been asking for a decade that you alluded to that I wonder why we can't do is, why can't we be transparent about the relative corporate take of mining versus government take in every country to be able to assess the fiscal terms of the deal? You say that, I mean, even the companies that I know that publish the financials don't do it in a way that allows for that basic comparison of what is the state getting versus what is the company getting in a particular context. Why can we not do that as a basic understanding of the fiscal take? So, okay, I'm just going to put those out there because I do think that these are some of the questions that we're not addressing, and I want to have time for you all to address it. Pedro, let me
Lisa,
apologize.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to jump
Yeah,
in
yeah.
on your second point.
Yes.
Sorry, because a lot of my work on site has actually confirmed what you say. The communities are not benefiting. And one of the reasons they are not benefiting is because the national government is not interested in putting that money back into the community. So it's not always the problem of the investor or the mining companies. It's a problem of coordination on national development and what those communities need. And often the companies get stuck in the middle. And it's a real problem. And I'll shut up there so Pedro can speak. Hi,
But
Pedro.
sorry,
It's good to see you.
sorry, Lisa, will we have time to cover
Yes,
your
yes, I want
questions?
to be able
Okay,
to
okay,
come back.
perfect. Yeah, yeah,
And then
yeah. Okay,
maybe
okay.
Yeah.
I want to get to Pedro
Be-
and Joe's initial comments,
Yeah,
and then
because
I will. Yeah.
just not to leave those. Let me just before Pedro, sorry,
Please, please, Ignacio,
a couple
please.
of quick comments. No,
Yes, 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 please.
in terms of why companies don't do a better job communicating the take of the companies and the government, I fully agree with that. And we actually at some point used to put a lot of emphasis into what is called the fourth financial statement, which is roughly a chart that shows of all the revenue that gets into the mining company, what percentage of that revenue goes to the government in form of taxes, goes to the community in terms of social development, goes to supply chain in terms of developing other ancillary business or other entrepreneurs and business, a lot of them related to the communities. What percentage of that goes into the workers, taxes in many different forms, etc., and what percentage goes to stays in the company in forms of either retained earnings or dividends, no? And those graphics are really, really telling that show, no? And of course, it's going to depend on the company and the area where they operate, but they tend to show how you can see that the biggest majority of the pie goes to third people by far, no? Government, workers, communities, no? So I would say that I fully in favor of that disclosure, and I not only that, but I have also supported that disclosure a lot because I think it's going to be very helpful for the whole mining environment and society. And on the other, your initial question on the show how important is mining for communities, I would say it's clearly not, you're not going to be able to convince them with that argument whether you want to do mining in their own areas or not. That's not the argument. No? But my point is to try to negotiate a fair deal. If you start with the concept that mining is bad, that mining is harmful, that mining is nocive, that mining is going to create a lot of issues, you start a negotiating point that is really bad. So my point is that's like an overarching principle that you need to keep in mind before you even start doing the negotiations. But when you negotiate, you need to make sure that you reach a deal that is fair and sustainable and creates value to all parties.
Thank you for those clarifications. And we do need to come back to it. I would say on the last point, we should also start negotiations from the perspective of this hasn't been fair before.
Well,
So,
I think-
we have.
I think,
Yeah,
Lisa,
Mary,
too,
please.
on that last one too, I think it's hard, right? We keep talking about the communities, but when we're talking about a fair deal, there's usually two parties to the deal. It's the government and the investor or mining operator, whatever it is, right? The communities are often not represented, right? Like everyone assumes that the government is representing them. And I think, others have made this point. Sometimes they're not represented or the money doesn't funnel its way back. I think that's the common curse of, the North versus South in generic contexts of the North has the resource riches, but the capital is in the South. And so the capital flows one way. And that's a perpetual problem. I don't think an individual mining contract is going to solve that, right? Like I think there's much bigger governance questions around that. And I think you're right. Like mining companies get stuck in this. And we want to figure out what fairness is to move forward from that. And that's not easy. And I'm not, I'm empathetic to that from, the private sector perspective. And I think if, more companies did publish everything and were transparent and things like that, be there. But I'll stop there. I have a lot of ideas on how we can get there or things like that, but I'll leave it there.
Do not forget the the ideas you have on how to get there. We need those. So I'm just going to bring in Pedro and Joe in that order to the conversation, and with apologies to the participants that Pedro's challenges joining was all on our side because of our weird technological login issues. So we'll resolve that for next time. Pedro, thank you so much for joining. You have been part of some of the most foundational and important continent-wide mineral sector strategies in Africa, especially over the past decades, although with global relevance and importance. And I'm just, let me open, especially with what you've heard, to any initial reflections. I suppose, most interested in what aspects of fairness you would see as either explicitly or implicitly incorporated in these strategies, and to what extent those have or have not been realized, and where you would say that that leads us now for this conversation and what needs to be resolved.
Lisa and colleagues, once again, my sincere apologies for joining late. We had all sorts of technical problems. It's one of those days, but I'm here, and I think I arrived at the right time. First, Amir, I fully agree with you that we need an expanded deal room, because the deal rooms these days are confined to governments and mining companies. And yet, for us to be able to indeed generate that shared value creation, we need that expanded deal room. And this is been recognized right from the beginning. I'll say when the MMSD process started in 2000, I mean, there was this understanding that mining has benefits, costs and benefits, and therefore we need to bring those stakeholders all together to try and determine how to define value and how to structure the distribution of those benefits. So I think let's perhaps retain that concept that the deal room needs to be expanded, and then negotiate how to ensure that indeed that expanded deal room ensures that everybody has the same capacity to engage in the issues and be able to influence, therefore, the final outcome. Because that also is a problem. That sometimes, of course, through existing instruments, and here I'm referring to the environmental and social impacts studies and assessments and so on, where indeed all of us go and engage the communities to consult and ensure that their views, aspirations are captured in the outcome, final outcome, in the contracts, licenses, and so on. But the question always is the extent to which what is captured reflects exactly the needs and aspirations of those stakeholders. So, so we have all those instruments, but implementation matters. So the processes matter. And this is where sometimes I think all of us fail, is because we don't give enough time to engage seriously, for example, in understanding what are those the benefits that matter the most to local communities or to other constituencies for that matter. The World Economic Forum, as part of their responsible mining initiative, has tried to identify what are those values, dimensions that are key in any effort to try and find or reach a fair deal. Lisa, I said before, and I would like to say again, that I fully agree with you that a deal that is too good isn't sustainable. So the question for all of us here, therefore, is how would you define a fair deal? And for me, that definition is that it has to generate shared value creation. And it has to maximize the core benefits for everyone. So, but let me go back, if you don't mind, to the MMSD before I go to some of the things that are involved in that reflects the aspirations of member states. So sorry, to the World Economic Forum Minerals Value Management Framework. So this has 7 value dimensions. So the first one, and this is where perhaps the mining companies and government spend a lot of time, is the fiscal benefits. So to fix the taxes and royalties so that there is a fair distribution of the benefits, and the legal and the regulatory framework to provide some certainty on the terms and conditions, the stabilization clause, everything else that really creates that elusive good business environment. The second one is employment and skills. And that, I mean, those are some of the questions that we have to ask. Is this project going to generate the jobs that everyone is aspiring for? Because every time that there's an announcement, there's this big project coming, there's all sorts of expectations that are created. And the problem always becomes how to manage those expectations, how to narrow the differences between, again, what constitutes the benefits. And in some of us, I mean, have worked on the entire conversation about local content, but often the question that we have to ask is, how local is local content? And again, I come from Mozambique, and that, I mean, we see here and there some manifestations of that. So we need to be able to ask that question. And that's why I'm saying, really, we need to spend more time engaging and making sure that what we get as the metric is the right metric. So the third is about environment and biodiversity. I mean, that's, I mean, is critical for any SDG discussion. Is about doing all of those things within planetary boundaries, about decoupling environmental, social impacts from economic growth. So that's important. So the fourth is social cohesion. Often, I mean, when we have a big project coming, I mean, that creates all sorts of negative impacts in that the fabric, and it's important, therefore, that we internalize that in the project design and implementation. And so the social cohesion, the cultural and social economic implications. Fifth, procurement and local supply. Again, that is local content, is about ensuring that small and medium enterprises have an access to the opportunity that is generated by mining. And by the way, ICMM, I mean, in their mining contribution index has in one, that's edition number 2, they have sort of, they came with that number that 60% of the cost of a large mining project is procurement. In other words, if we can localize procurement, we'll be able to retain a greater share of the wealth that is created in the mining sector locally. So it's important. So that's why perhaps in our discussions during the, as part of the Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum, we'd identify procurement and local supply as a very important value dimension. 6, beneficiation and downstream industry. I mean, this is about value addition. This is about resource-driven industrialization. And this, I mean, takes me, before I go to the 7th and last, which is infrastructure, again, how to ensure that infrastructure that is established to access all deposits and so on can open up opportunities in other sectors of the economy so that we don't have enclaves. And that, I mean, one of some of the things that indeed are a preoccupation here on the continent, which are captured in instruments such as the African Mining Vision, is indeed how to promote resource-driven industrialization and economic diversification. How to ensure that we don't have a mining that is about digging holes, taking those ores and exporting to all sorts of destinations without retaining the value locally. And that's an important conversation. I mean, I was in April in Kampala attending an African Regional Forum Sustainable Development, as well as the African Leadership Forum, and the president of Uganda there said that, well, I mean, over his dead body, he would allow raw materials to be exported for others. So this just illustrates how the issue of value addition is important on the continent. And in the African Mining Vision, we have articulated how to, I mean, what are the key tenets for us to be able to achieve that? And there's a supporting instrument as well in the form of counter mining vision guidebook, which enables then the domestication of the vision at the counter level. The question then becomes, with all of those instruments, and I have, I mean, a couple of other references. For example, I like the OECD 8 guiding principles for durable extractive contracts. So in other words, we have the instruments. And I mean, if you don't mind, I'll just pick one or two of those principles, because I mean, if we have those, we have all of those instruments, the visions, the guidebooks, the step-by-step guides. Why is it that things are not changing on the ground? That's the biggest, I think, challenge of all of us. I mean, some of us have been this, I mean, 40 years or so. I mean, I always like to share that my first encounter with these issues was in 1984 in Blantyre, Malawi, when, I mean, with other mining experts, we formulated the first SADC mining protocol. And it's all about, I mean, for getting the most of our commodities. So yet, 40 years later, I mean, we are here having these conversations. I hope I'll dedicate the next 40 years to making this happen. Because indeed, that's the only thing that matters, I guess, for a person like us, is to ensure that there is shared value creation. So the OECD 8 guiding principles for durable extractive contracts, there are a couple that I think talk to what I've said earlier. One is that durable extractive contracts should be aligned with the long-term vision and strategy defined by the host government. Are mining companies aware of those visions? Do they engage as part of their, I mean, in their strategic rooms, the vice president of strategies, do they, before they go and engage there, do they try and understand the country? What is it that would give them that lasting social license to operate beyond the contract that they sign with the governments? So understanding that context is important, because otherwise, I mean, you will believe certainly that whatever you've signed and agreed with the Minister of Mines or the Director of Mines there represents a good deal, but that may just represent one part of the aspirations in a country. So I would say, let's use the instruments that are there, available for all of us, to try and get that elusive fair deal. And I could go on and cite one or two more. I mean, for example, durable extractive contracts are anchored in a transparent, constructive, long-term commercial relationship and operational partnership between host government, investors, and communities. Again, the idea that we have to bring to this extended deal room all the stakeholders that matter. Perhaps, I mean, I can stop here, but there's quite a lot that one could say to really try and get to that elusive place. And I mean, the assumption that, I mean, governments represent necessarily the interest of the entire country, I think, needs to be questioned. I mean, as part of any company's risk enterprise assessment, we have to really check all of those things and create all sorts of scenarios. Foresight analysis today is important so that, again, you protect as much as possible the deal that you've entered in. So I think it's the responsibility of the mining company to take that extra step and understand that sometimes, I'm not saying that it's always the case, governments do not necessarily represent the entire interest of the country, especially the communities in distant places out there where mine occurs. So that's the balance that I think we need to achieve. Sorry for speaking.
No, thank you so much, Pedro. You have spent 40 years working on this, but we're going to make sure that you don't spend the next 40 years. You can spend the next 40 years celebrating your accomplishments as we really bring to bear your extraordinary work. Joe, let me bring you in and then really want to open it up for further discussion. But this precise question, I think that Pedro seated would be wonderful to hear from you, which is that one of the challenges of negotiating deals where you've been central is that not all stakeholders' interests are represented at the table, even at Sally's large table. And as we have discussed on this call, and it was really a takeaway from our first call, is that the distribution of the impacts and benefits are not aligned. That is, those who bear the greatest impacts are not the ones who are poised in these deals or in reality at all to receive the greatest benefits. So it would be great to hear your experience from the negotiating table about whether these negotiations are suited to these diverse expectations and realities, and if not, how they could do better.
Sure. Well, thank you, Lisa. I felt that each of the speakers were very clear, and I think there's very little disagreement on the general principles of what constitutes a fair deal or the elements of a fair deal. It's the implementation of those principles. How do we get to a conclusion that is fair to all parties? Because I completely agree with Pedro's statement and all of the others that a deal that's too good for any particular party is not sustainable. And so I like to start, most of what I've done in the last 30 years has been on the sponsor side. I started on the government side and still represent one or two governments in their extractive industries. And so I think I've gotten a fair perspective on this. And there is a dislocation of the central government, which is the legal owner of the resources, and contractual wise, the procurer of the services, whether they be a concession, whether they be a PSA, or whatever format they take. And that is something that I think extractive industry clients have become more and more sensitive to over the last decade. But there's only so much you could do to make sure that the procurement and the negotiations include all the stakeholders if your counterparty is the central government. And I do think it's a greater burden on the extractive industry investors. I think overarching principles, I think governments need to spend a bit more time formulating their objectives, make them clear, both in principle and in specifics. And they could do that through marking what the industry is on at a particular point in time. I know when we started 40 plus years ago on this, much of our role in government advice was education. I think there's a tremendous number now of advisors, both financial and legal, that have that background and can serve that role well. I also believe, as Sally indicated, there's plenty of information out there. How is that information used? How is it digested? But I think, what a lot of this discussion has focused around are particular stakeholders. And I think governments are, at least in some of the transactions I've worked on, have become more proactive because they realize that regardless of what the contract says, if the local stakeholders, and then how do you, as Pedro said, how do you define local, have to be satisfied. And they can't be just run over and, by either the central government or the mining company. That just doesn't work anymore. And I would argue never really worked. So a clear expectation of what the government is procuring, because that's how most of these projects start. And that includes all of the elements that have been mentioned, particularly those that Pedro has mentioned. And then the transparency of the agreement in terms of publication, in terms of community meetings. And you can't be afraid of presenting a transparent agreement. It's either, there are no secrets much anymore. So, that will all come out anyway. You're much better off having those discussions. And then the question is, what do you do with the discussions with the local community, which I think needs to be brought in sooner rather than later. Oftentimes, the procurement proceeds, there are negotiations between the mining company or the oil and gas company and the central government, and then it's not quite an afterthought. But then there's bringing in the local interests. I think that has to happen really up front, and I put the burden on the government because the initial burden on the government because the mining company is not involved initially. I'm talking 2 or 3 years before procurement actually hits the market, that these issues all need to be ironed out and need to be discussed. And if something is clear, this is the model, both financial, and I would suggest there's plenty of expertise for the government to create its own financial model, not just to rely on the extractive industries financial model, and then have discussions between the various companies vying for the contract and have the financial models be discussed. And that, I think, is a way of reaching an agreement on an agreed upon model for the transaction. That's what we've seen recently. So to that extent, that may satisfy some of Sally's concerns on transparency. What I was getting at was protecting, and I'm not a big fan of confidentiality agreements. They're great on paper. They're very difficult to enforce. This is a competitive business, and you don't want to share all of your secrets, inefficiencies, and driving a return with your competitors. I mean, that's just natural. So I go back to some fundamental principles, and that is clear policy, a lot more time spent by the government and the local stakeholders formulating what they want, and then having their own models created based on the information that's available, and putting a stricter parameter on timing, because markets change. The need for capital is mobile, and capital, the reality of capital is that it will seek the best returns it can find, and geographically they're not, with some exceptions, not wedded to a particular area. And we've seen that. We've seen a migration of capital in the last few years, private capital I'm talking about, moving, sadly, because I've spent 30 years of my life in sub-Saharan Africa, moving from sub-Saharan Africa to Southeast Asia or other places where capital can be deployed quicker and returns can be obtained quicker. So all of that goes into government preparation and including all the stakeholders. And then the private sector has to make sure with their independent diligence that all of this has occurred and all of this is realistic. Realistically, the models can be achieved before you spend the millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in some instances over the life of a project, making those investments. So I'd say the initial burden is on the government. Spend the time. There are tremendous resources out there. And put a diligence obligation on the private sector. The private sector has to do its part. They're just not selling widgets. They're selling long-term investments long-term impact on the communities. So that's from the implementation side, which, you know, a lawyer more or less is on, rather than some of the broader concepts. Those are some of the things I've seen over the last 30 to 40 years.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you. I want to open it all up for discussion among everyone, hopefully with now more rapid fire responses. But let me just say two things to see that following what Joe said. We heard from Pedro that he spent 40 years articulating what governments want, which I'll affirm because we've worked with the governments. I don't think that that's not clear. Of course, in particular country contexts, of course, much more could be articulated, but that I would push back and just say that that largely exists. We know what governments want. There are wonderful continent-wide and national critical mineral strategies that are far from being realized. So I just want to challenge a bit this idea that we don't know what the expectations are, and the question is why they're not being met. And then on the idea of confidentiality, because I do think that one of the concepts that has surfaced in this conversation is how much more information would be useful from the private sector. That too, I would say we debunked about 15 years ago the idea that there's really a need for as much confidentiality in the sector as persists. As contract transparency has become much more mainstream, and even before that, we know many of these mining companies are working in joint ventures, they share lawyers. We know that there's a lot more known within the sector than is shared with their government partners. And yet having more clarity on some of these aspects of the deals from the government, from the company side would be, especially after this conversation, I'm even more convinced of how useful that would be to be able to have a real shared understanding and the trust that I think goes to a lot of what Ignacio was saying and others before. We should be recognizing that we're not starting from a place of mutual trust right now. We're starting from a place of, okay, why has this been so hard? We've been promised a lot for the past 30 years and that hasn't been realized. So we're starting from that place, not from a clean slate. So with that, maybe if we can really try to make it conversational, Amir, I'll let you start.
Lisa, do you mind if I just jump in very quickly on a point you just made? Just thinking as a litigator, and your point about the fact that governments have these plans like critical mineral strategies, I think oftentimes disputes arise in specific contexts. And I think that the point of determining what the government really wants has to be determined in a very specific with regard to a particular project. And perhaps that's where the work is not being done. It's all very well and good to have grand, sort of strategic objectives, and this is what we want at a kind of macro level, but it's that kind of with regard to this particular project. That's all I'd add to that. I don't want to take away from anyone else's
thanks.
time.
I just, having looked at the same disputes as you, Christoph, I think, a lot of the disputes are, as if there was surprise that the governments want to better regulate the environment or want better fiscal terms or want to process locally. And those shouldn't be such a surprise. Those are, we have a pretty good sense of what governments want and are not realizing. So I think there's some question of, how much do we need them to articulate and how much should we understand that governments are want, and even in particular contexts.
I think some of that, Lisa, goes to proactivity of the government and there are mutual obligations in these agreements. And, it's not just on one side. It's not just and I've learned this more from the government side, seeing the difficulty that government sometimes has to achieve the obligations that it agreed to. And a lot of those deal with infrastructure development that generally fall on the government side and generally impact the timing of a development. And I just think that that's where a fair number of disputes that I've been involved in, not necessarily on contracts I've negotiated, but as an advisor where a dispute has previously occurred, is that there is a disagreement as to the implementation of different obligations. And that's why I would agree with Christoph that the more detailed you could get I think the better opportunity you have of having the vision and having the goals be met. Everyone understands everything that
Yeah.
Pedro said. Every mining company knows all of the.
Sorry, Joe, if I may come here. So if you go to the Fraser Institute Mining Survey, they try and understand what is the risk profile of a country in general. It's what well, this is a little bit a reaction to what you said, Christopher. Romeo. We have to narrow this down to the project. But if you just look at this from that perspective, you may miss very important aspects for you to be able to get that fair deal. So that's why I was referring to having the strategists in the mining companies, or to spend a little more time into doing real risk profiling of the countries in which they operate.
Pedro,
Yeah.
I'm gonna fight you a little bit on
before
this.
you come in. So
Yeah.
if you are going to invest billions of dollars in Simandou, $20 billion, this is the estimate, or even more than that. I mean, it's part of your due diligence to understand the country in which you are going to operate, and not limit yourself to Simandou. This is my mine site. This is my square miles and so on.
Yeah.
But then the
Yeah.
rest of what's happening in that particular country is of no interest to you. And that, goes back to some of the things that we used to see in the past, which was a mine site with soldiers and everybody else. You protect your area, and that's it. But that alone will not give you the license that you want. That's what we really need to spend a little bit more time into understand that a good business model is one that is risk-proof. And then what are the risks? You have to engage into understanding that in a multidimensional way. It's not what the government that you're dealing with that to give you that information. You really have to utilize all of your intelligence sources to try and understand the space and engage accordingly.
I would guess that Ignacio
Interesting.
I would guess that Ignacio would be able to tell us about that kind of depth of research that they do. And to be honest, it would surprise me that a company that's going to invest that level into a state would be so narrow. And it's, I think it does, both things are true, that we need to look at a particular project and they need to take a bigger picture view of the country. And I assume they do.
I mean, country
Can we
risk
ask
is-
him? I'm so sorry.
country risk is
Sorry, no,
fundamental.
just to cover what
Country risk is
Christoph,
fundamental. I agree.
So
Ignacio,
fully
you
agree
wanna
that,
speak?
before choosing a particular country in which you're going to invest, you clearly do a lot of due diligence, no? And no, fortunately or unfortunately, there are countries that have a history and a legacy of having done things better than others. So clearly, all those things are taken into account, and at the end, is a risk that the investor needs to take before making an investment decision. However, countries need to be mindful, as I said at the beginning, that the more attractive countries are going to continue being those that have the clear, stable rules, that are clear in terms of who you're dealing with, are reliable partners, there's rule of law, contract enforcement, the culture understands mining. So the more developed a country is on those areas and the more history they have following those principles, the more attractive it's going to be to an investor.
Yeah, but I wanted to say something here. The mining investing companies, I mean, there could be 3 or 4 of them, but in a consortium, they know, or they should know, that these countries, or certain countries, are very weak in enforcement, and will not be able to, without help, enforce this. Now, I know we're treating them a bit like children here, saying, and I think there's a problem there, saying, well, Joe says they need to be more informed. I agree with that. But there's a political basis for them not having the wherewithal to go out and get that information. And I think we need to help them. And the mining companies and the investors know these countries. I mean, if you look at Bolivia, you know what's going to happen when you go negotiate a lithium contract. I mean, historically, it's not a long 100 years, but you know what's going to happen down that line. You're going to hope it doesn't happen, but you're going to pretty well figure out that you have a risk there. It's just an example, though, okay? And you know that these governments are not well structured, that they're political infighting, and yet, you do your due diligence and you cross your fingers and say, well, I hope they get their proverbial quote unquote shit together, okay? And usually, and we all do, but sometimes they don't. So what do we do about that? And I think it incumbs upon all of us to assist in that, but we have to convince them, of course, that that they need it, and that's usually a big psychological problem because they don't want to hear what they don't know. So I think we're dancing around a problem here. I hear some condensation here. It's the government's problem. It's the government has to do this. The government has to figure it out. The government has to enforce. We all agree with that. But the reality is they don't, or they fail, or they're
Well,
weak. So where do we go from there?
Yeah, I'd
but
be
Sally,
interested,
Can I,
Sally, in
yeah.
knowing, where do
Sally,
you go from there? If your counterparty, I mean,
Joe,
does
can I
that
let, I'm
mean?
so
yeah, but
sorry. Can
like,
I let
yeah, but
Amir
hang
jump
on.
in? Because I interrupted him earlier.
Sorry,
Thanks, Amir.
I'm gonna just kind of jump in on a couple of things here. One, I think we could go on all day about the imbalance or the asymmetry of information and things like that, right? Like, I think that's something we all have experienced it. Let's be very direct. I've worked with most of you on
Yeah.
this panel. We all know that, right? I don't think anybody's disagreeing with that. But I think kind of trying to bring it back to what can we actually measure here in terms of fairness? And like, what does it mean to be fair? And like, how do you look at that? So like the first thing is when you sign the deal, you think it's fair. If you don't think it's fair, you don't sign the deal. People
Right.
forget that, right? Day one is there. So this implementation question and this flexibility idea, Sally, that you have is great in theory, but I'm going to say it's in theory and I'm going to challenge you on it, right? The reality of it is twofold. One is you have that there's underwriters on this. Underwriters will not take on flexibility. They do not like it. They want certainty. They're making a 7, 10, 15-year loan.
Yeah, I
They want to
know.
know they're going to get paid back. Flexibility, it's incompatible. The second part of it, though, I think, like if we're thinking about practical things we can do, and it echoes into this transparency, is bringing in some of those financial models and assumptions into the contracts themselves. We leave all of that out. We never include a financial model. We're afraid we are constrained as lawyers because we like Word more than Excel. And I think we as lawyers need to push forward in that. Like I think I always get very frustrated with this. I think I've talked to Lisa about this probably over the years a few times. We have to think of contracts more broadly. We're moving into smart contracting. We're moving into all these new technologies coming in, we can think about things broader. So if you built a contract that was flexible based on the assumptions, but you model and identify the assumptions up front, which you do in a financial model, it's already there. You stress test it. You have a P90 case, a P95 case. You have you always do three scenarios. No investor makes a decision on that. And if any of those, 12 levers or whatever they might be, whether it's windfall, cost of material, steel prices, whatever it may be, vary, then you can go back and have a forced and structured negotiation around it. If we can get to that, where we have everybody willing to do that, maybe we can get to a point where we can talk about what's fair or not, right? And so it's really hard to. I will struggle with this because nobody wants to get to that first step of sharing what they say, and we need to move on with that. So sorry, I'm jumping in. It's maybe shifting the conversation a little bit, but I will go on all day talking about government capacity or incapacity and negotiating skills or not skills. But like, I want to get into what we can actually do to measure this and make this right.
Amir, I've worked with in the last 10 years where there have been appendices of the agreed upon financial model.
Yeah.
One of the things you try to do, uh, and I think it's important for both the private sector and the government, is to look at all of the risks that the model uncovers and make sure you do your best to try to cover those risks in the operative contracts. And in terms of flexibility, I've seen some long-term contracts have 5 or 6 year, some 7 year look backs using the model as the guiding principle. And no one's going to be happy. I haven't met either a sponsor or a government that's happy with an agreement or a deal after 5 or 6 years. But if you have
Exactly.
if you have an agreed upon model, that's one that you can do a look back on and potentially adjust. And I think that you're seeing more and more of those, particularly in some of the more significant investment type
Yeah.
transactions.
And Joe, I would try to say one of the constraints we have is we sign these things, right? And putting a financial model with formulas and different assumptions and things
Right.
into a contract, even as an appendice, is really tough. Like, I
It
think this is
is.
where we have to get smarter. And it's a bigger, broader question for the legal profession. And how do you actually integrate digital components into it? And it's
Yes.
really hard because
It's really
my
hard.
version is different than your version, right? And like,
Right.
you know,
Yeah, but it's doable. It's doable.
I think it's
You just
doable
have to
too.
work harder.
I agree.
It's hard. I think that that's what all this conversation
Yeah.
has really uncovered. It's a difficult industry, and it's difficult to satisfy all of the particular interests, and we do our best.
Lisa, if I may, I would like to put you on the spot as CCSI.
Huh.
I mean, Perini and what Nicholas, I think some time ago, I mean, they curated these transformational maps for the mining sector. This is the World Economic Forum platform where we try and look at these things. So my argument is that institutions like yours perhaps should help, because I mean, there is this idea that governments are the faulty party here, is to really help the governments to develop those transformational maps, especially those ones that are very rich in mineral endowments and mineral resources, and then design or support them in designing what would be the pathways to realizing all of the things that are in their respective visions for the extractive industry. And then that would be part of the database that will be available for mining companies to understand a little bit the trajectory of and how to position themselves better to respond and answer the expectations of that particular country. Because managing expectations, as I said earlier, it's important. What's his name? I mean, Luke Danielson, I mean, had prepared something which he called the Architecture for Change. And I think as part again of the MMSD, perhaps we may wish to go and revisit some of those things, because indeed there were a series of questions that if you want a fair deal, you have to go through. Ask yourself, is this thing, this project going to contribute X, Y, and Z? For me in particular, there are a couple of questions that I would like to see in a fair deal. Let me perhaps share one or two things. One is, how local is local content, as I said earlier? How linked is the extractive sector with the rest of the economy? We don't want enclaves. We don't want a mining that is there, that procures everything from outside, that really does not generate benefits from that particular confine. How many jobs are we creating? How much wealth can be retained locally? Again, earlier, is mining the best land use option? Again, this is more for governments, because sometimes, and these days in particular, I mean, that's one question that we need to answer. And some of the things that we are doing here at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa is to promote this idea of carbon credit markets. And perhaps in certain places, just leaving your forest there would make you more money than cutting all of those trees and mine. And that's part of the strategic environmental assessments, I would say. So, Lisa, I mean, that's a challenge to you. And I think, I mean, I'm here, perhaps we could challenge everybody else, all the interested parties, to contribute into that global challenge on transformation on the extractive sector, bringing all these stakeholders' interests together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro, and to everyone. I have a minute, so let me try to recollect, and then there's absolutely an imperative that we continue this conversation. The questions that have been asked, I will capture and share, and we will find many ways of continuing this discussion. The premise, I think what has been underscored in this conversation is the premise of this whole series, which is that we have not managed to achieve what many of us have dedicated our careers to achieving. Pedro, we have been trying, as you know, to support governments for about 20 years. And on reflection, communities have not been made better off. The linkages that you described have not materialized. Innovation is not happening in mineral value chains. Local processing is not happening. I can point to some structural reasons it's not happening, financial barriers and so on, but this is what we need to assess together. And the wealth has not been retained. And we don't have transparency to even be able to assess that. We don't even have 25 years into this, the ability to say where the wealth is going and how it's being distributed. So I just cannot underscore enough how valuable and how much I appreciate this discussion, because I firmly believe that we can do better, that with your collective experiences and insights, we can find constructive approaches to do better. One thing I will say that was a starting point of this whole discussion that I don't think we resolved at the end is this question of what is fair, because to the point that the deal at the beginning is a reflection that everyone thinks it's fair. I'm not, that again, that I would say points to one measure of fairness, which is that there was an agreement at one point of time on a set of expectations. It doesn't go to an objective measurement of fairness. It doesn't go to whether the communities consider it to be fair and so on. So even the premise that the agreement at the outset reflects an agreement on fairness, I think we should question. Does it align with countries' strategies? Does it realize the African mining vision? There are other ways to assess whether a deal is quote unquote fair or good at the outset. That is not just saying that there was a meeting of the minds among those who signed it. And then of course many disputes just point back to that original contract and say, see, there was a meeting of the minds. This is what was agreed at the outset. But that, again, that just solidifies a point in time without having this fundamental question of whether that deal at the outset was good. So I sincerely regret how fast the time goes and that we can't continue, but we must continue this conversation, both with these wonderful experienced panelists and more broadly with our community. And Christoph will find a way to ensure that we do that. But for the sake of time right now, let me just thank all of you so much for these rich insights. I'm going to try to capture some of them to share more widely. Of course, we'll post this online and encourage others to watch so that we can continue this very rich conversation. So thank you so much, and to be continued.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank
Thank
you,
you.
Thank you very
Steptoe, and
much.
thank you, Christoph, and thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.